Thank you so much for being here for this talk today by Foy Scalf. I'm Ann Peel. I'm a special collections librarian here at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And Foy is joining us from the Oriental Institute at Chicago, where he is a scholar, a librarian, and a humanist interested in the history of the ancient world, the methods of its study, and how to spread that knowledge. Foy is research associate, head of the Research Archives, and head of the Integrated Database Project at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. He also acts as principal investigator for a corpus-based digital project known as OIDU, the Oriental Institute Demotic Ostraca Online. He received his PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago with a dissertation examining funerary literature from Roman Egypt and identifying its origins in the oral traditions attested in graffiti from previous centuries. He curated a special exhibit for the Oriental Institute Museum called Book of the Dead, Becoming God in Ancient Egypt, and he assembled a group of internationally acclaimed scholars as editor of the accompanying catalog. In 2016, he received the Archival Innovator Award from the Society for American Archivists for his role in the Oriental Institute's Integrated Database Project. I first got in touch with Foy through his colleague Brian Muse back in October when we were in the process of updating our cataloging of early manuscripts in the Chapin Library's collections. We had these two groups of Egyptian fragments, which you'll be introduced to by Foy momentarily, but we really had only the vaguest records of what the texts were, and we had absolutely no idea of whether they would be of interest to scholars beyond Williams. As it turns out, they were. Foy has just been an absolute pleasure to work with, and we're really excited to be hearing more about his research today. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. First, this event will be recorded and made available to viewers afterwards. We've left plenty of time at the end of the session for questions, which you're welcome to submit through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any point during this talk. We will ask you to use the Q&A rather than sort of the raise hand and ask in person feature, just to make it easier for us to kind of keep track of those questions. Finally, before we begin, we acknowledge with respect and humility that Williams College stands on the occupied ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region commonly called Williamstown, Massachusetts. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from their valued homelands, today their community, a sovereign tribal nation, resides in Wisconsin and is now known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And with that, I will turn it over to Foy for his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. Really appreciate that introduction, and welcome to everybody for coming and listening to my ongoing research on these really interesting materials at various places at Williams College, Chapin Library, and the museum as well. As Anne mentioned right up front, I need to definitely thank Anne and also my colleague Brian Muse here at the Oriental Institute, University of Chicago. Without their involvement and their initiative, I had no idea this material existed. So it was very nice to have Anne reach out to Brian and Brian to me to look further at the material in this collection. And I should just say, for the most part, for most of my talk, I'll be talking about sort of two groups of material. On the one hand, papyrus fragments, like the ones that you see on the title slide here on the screen. But in addition to that, some linen bandage fragments that had originally been used in the mummification process to wrap the human body. And there is one slide near the end of this talk that has an image with human remains in it. So just I will bring that up again when we're near the end, and we can discuss it further just to show you how these wrappings were used. So this story, as Anne mentioned, really starts with this album of papyrus fragments that's in the Chapin Library Special Collections. And you see that here on the screen. And this is what Anne contacted my colleague Brian Muse about, to sort of say, what do you think about what's in here? What are all these texts? And you can see on the outside, the cover of this album, you can see this cartouche written here with hieroglyphs naming Ptolemy, one of the kings of the Ptolemaic royal house that controlled Egypt from 305 to 30 BC. And before we get into the contents of this album, I just wanted to point out that it seems that whoever put this album together, we'll discuss that in a minute about what we know about its provenance and how it came together, but it seems that they were putting it together very intentionally. And I presume that the use of Ptolemy here in the cartouche on the cover is a reflection of the prominence of the name Ptolemy in the decipherment of hieroglyphs by Champollion in 1822, as it appeared on the Rosetta Stone. So the name played a very important role. You can actually see the same cartouche from Champollion's famous letter announcing the decipherment here on the screen, and how the Egyptian hieroglyphs stood for individual consonants in the name of Ptolemy, and how that related to the Greek version on the Rosetta Stone. So it seems whoever put this album together and embossed its binding here and its cover was doing so very intentionally, evoking this tradition of Champollion and the decipherment of hieroglyphs to sort of hint at what's inside. And the composition of the album really seems related to what we were actually talking about before this talk started, an interest in the history of the book. And so it sort of reflects Pettigree's little blurb in his volume about the book in the Renaissance, where he says, today papyri survive mostly as isolated shards, little more than an evocative fragment of the first written literary culture. And when we look at some of the materials that describe the provenance of this piece, we can see that intention reflected. That is the intention to illustrate the history of the book pre-codex, pre-printing press, pre-medieval manuscript, even going back to scrolls on papyrus from ancient Egypt. And you can see here the little blurb from the accession files: papyri, fragments of papyrus containing hieroglyphic inscriptions and figures inlaid on 11 sheets of cardboard with guards, folio, full light brown Morocco with a panel of blue Morocco inlaid on front cover. And then the only, so far, information about a date to when this material had originated here, 662 BC. And then we have the little annotation, the name Quaritch, a very interesting item showing what was used in place of paper over 2,000 years ago. Such examples are rarely seen outside of museums. And then the annotation Drake 41-2, and then again at the bottom, annotation Drake 3-1922. So what we can see is that the material inside this album was, it seems, put together for the purpose of illustrating the history of the book, which is interesting because that's largely how this volume is used now, at least as according to what Anne tells me, that this is largely used in classes illustrating the history of the book, pre-print and even pre sort of what most people think of as medieval Western books. And so the rough provenance history is as follows. Alfred Clark Chapin had purchased this album in 1922. He purchased it from James Frederick Drake, a book dealer and rare books, who himself had purchased it from Bernard Quaritch. Now, where did Quaritch get it, or did Quaritch even put it together? That still remains a question. And as you can tell when we go through the rest of this talk, I mean, this is very much research that's ongoing, so I don't have all of the conclusions to all of these questions yet, but it's something I'm very interested in trying to figure out, is the origin of the scraps, quote unquote, that are in this manuscript, the papyrus fragments. Did they belong to Quaritch? Was it Quaritch who put them together, or did Quaritch purchase this album already put together? These are questions that might be difficult, but might be able to solve by looking at how these fragments relate to other fragments and other collections and their provenance history. So this is roughly the chain of custody that we currently know, and it came from Chapin to obviously the special collections in Chapin Library today. Now, just to show you the contents of this album and to see what we're talking about, since you haven't seen these papyrus fragments yet, this is what we find inside. So matted pages for protecting the papyri, let's put that in quotes, since these fragments have been glued down with an adhesive now on these pages. And you can see there's various fragments oriented in various directions throughout the pages of this album. And this is, I should also say, this is pretty interesting. There are definitely lots of other examples from this time period of collecting, let's say Victorian, late 19th, early 20th century, where you have pastiche, right? So papyrus fragments that are all placed together to sort of look like a more complete papyrus. But I'm not sure I know of any other similar albums where these fragments were arranged in the pages of a codex format, one right after the other. So this is what you find in the album when you take a first look at it, is these papyrus fragments arranged on pages. Some of them, as you can see, put together as if they're large pieces. Other ones that seem to be from probably the same papyrus arranged in some kind of fashion. We'll talk about that in a second, next to each other, again, to give the sort of appearance that this is a larger, more substantial piece than it might be by arranging these fragments together. And you can see there's lots of different shapes and sizes of not just sort of larger pieces, but these smaller pieces as well. And so the challenge with something like this is, what do we do with all of these fragments, and how can we start to rearrange them and study them? So one aspect that Anne initially had asked about discussing in this lecture is sort of, well, what do we do with such fragments? Fragmentology now is becoming almost a field of its own, particularly in medieval manuscript studies, with folios being spread all over the world from once singular volumes now being reconstructed. And we're using a lot of the same methodology in Egyptology and ancient Near East studies to work with these types of fragments. So first question is sort of, what do we do first? Well, a lot of times, some of the first things that we look for are the original owner's names in the text, because that can tell you a lot and gives you a lead on how to track down other fragments of some of the same manuscripts. So just to give you an example, one of the first things that I did in looking at this material is just to go through and try to figure out how many actual fragments do we have that are separate individual fragments of papyrus, give them some type of number so we can keep track of them. And I just want to point out that you can see how these Victorian collectors were trying to reassemble papyri when they, in all likelihood, couldn't read hieroglyphs. Here you can see this piece, they sort of just lined it up with two other pieces that seem to have a yellow column on the fragments, and they just sort of pasted it in there as if it belonged. But when you start reading these, this is actually 3 different original manuscripts. So these are all separate pieces that can be separated and partially reconstructed into other larger manuscripts. But the compiler of this album was obviously just looking at the style of the individual fragments and trying to piece them together. Again, making this look like it's more of a substantial whole than it really is, and thereby probably increasing its value, making it more valuable to a collector. But one of the first things we start to look for are the individuals named in these texts, which can really give us something to work with in finding other fragments, other manuscripts, knowing a little bit more about them. And so one of the things you can look at in the hieroglyphs, and in this case, I should say too, all of these papyrus fragments in the album from Chapin Library, they're all written in cursive hieroglyphs. So you can see here, the shapes are recognizable. Even if you aren't familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphs, you can see basically what items are being depicted by the script. Some of the linen fragments that we'll see near the end of this talk, those are written in hieratic, a more cursive version of the Egyptian script. So these, it's fairly easy to identify a few things. And what we're often looking for is for the name of the god Osiris. And here's 4 different writings of that name. And the reason that we're sort of keying on that is it usually stands immediately in front of the name of the original owner that the papyrus was made for. So if we look at this fragment number 7 here, we blow it up a little bit, you can see here is the name of Osiris, followed by this original owner's name in 3 different sections fragmentary in these latter two. And what we then can determine is that this original owner was Osiris Userhat. And there's a little bit that we can say about Userhat that I'll come back to at the end. So sort of step one in looking at an album like this, after sort of determining its basic provenance information from the collection, from the institution, is to start looking at who these originally belong to, these manuscripts. And so just looking at a number of these quickly in the album, we can see here, again, this name Osiris preceding the name of the person who originally owned this. So this was for Osiris Nehemes Ra Tawi, the Justified. This is probably a bit later than the manuscript you were just looking at. I'll talk more about dates for these fragments a little bit more at the end. But again, now we have a lead for tracking down other manuscripts that belong to the same person. This section, belonging to Nes Khonsu here, Osiris Nes Khonsu, a woman, Justified. Again, looking for that name here, broken partially in half, but overall easy to read and restore what was there. Here's a very interesting one. Again, the name Osiris Ka Imter. So Osiris Ka Imter, so Ka Imter, the original owner of this papyrus. And one more, just again, to show you sort of how this works. This papyrus inscribed for Osiris, the Mary Netcher. This is a title, a priestly title from ancient Egypt. So the one who loves God. And here is the individual's name, Pa Di Hor. And then it named his mother, the lady of the house, named Isis something, and then it's broken off. So we don't know his mother's full name, but we have his name. Now, an interesting aspect of this page from the album where you're seeing these names, notice this scrap here that you can see in the upper right corner. It had this Osiris and then a name, and then this name has been erased. And although at first, when I saw this, I thought it said something else. The more I look at it, I'm pretty sure that it says Amenemhat in here, that this name has been erased. And this whole piece here is then probably part from actually a separate papyrus that has been glued into this to make it, again, look like these are all pieces of one large papyrus, when actually they're fragments, smaller fragments derived from other large papyri that would have broken off. So just looking at this, the way that I'm sort of imagining that this was put together is some dealer could have been in Egypt itself, although the way that this was put together, it strikes me as coming from Europe, but I don't know for sure right now. Some dealer who had lots of papyri around, and sort of the brittle edges of the papyri were flaking off, or large pieces that were sort of partial fragments. Decided, what can I do with all these fragments to make them valuable to sell? Nobody wants to buy these little tattered scraps, at least in this period. Some of these scraps today would be very valuable at an auction or something. But what to do with these? And so they must have put them together in this album thinking it would make it more appealing to sell to a collector. And so what you can see here again is these pieces being all put together. So part one is who these belong to can tell us a lot about reconstructing their history from ancient Egypt to today. So part one is looking at these personal names that are in the manuscripts themselves. Part two, then we want to see, well, what's the other text written on these fragments? And for this material, this is on a general level pretty easy. All of these texts belong to what we call the Book of the Dead from ancient Egypt, and was known to anybody who would look at this stuff. Even if you can't read Egyptian, you can go back and look at these fragments, and it's clear that these belong to manuscripts that are part of the Book of the Dead. Now, this lecture, we don't have time to go into all the details about what the Book of the Dead was, but just to give you a very simple description so you can have an idea of what we're talking about as we move forward and how we work on this. So what we call the Book of the Dead, which I should say that is a modern term that was born in the 1840s, in ancient Egypt was a compilation of spells. As you can see here, this is a papyrus from the Oriental Institute that belonged to a man named Irtiuru. And these spells were often, although not only, put together and inscribed in large compilations on papyrus scrolls. So this particular scroll that you're looking at here You're just looking at a small section from the beginning of it, but this is over 30 feet long in its original, and some of the longest papyri that we have, Book of the Dead papyri, are over 100 feet long. So they could put these scrolls together into very, very long examples. And the contents were a compilation of individual spells. So you can see the red sections in rubric here help to separate one spell from the other. So here's the beginning of a spell. Here's the beginning of a spell, beginning of a spell. And these spells are sort of gathered together in rough groups that of similar content, and then collected together on these larger papyri. And as I said, these papyri could be very long. So for the ancient Egyptians, when they described what the Book of the Dead was, again, when we say Book of the Dead, that's what we call it. The Egyptians called it the beginning of the spells of going forth by day. And I always like to point out that, notice, for the Egyptian, the conception of this is a plurality. Spells, these are multiple things all gathered together. So even when we say Book of the Dead as a sort of singular object, it's a bit different from the ancient Egyptian conception of these texts. And these texts were really meant to relieve the anxiety for living individuals about what happens after death. So they were commissioning these papyri in hopes that they would be beneficial to their transition in the afterlife. So they put these together, and then they put them in some place in their tombs, sometimes inside their coffins, sometimes inside statuettes inside the tomb. And also, I should say that they inscribe these texts on lots of other materials. It's not just on papyrus. As we said, we'll talk about linen bandages near the end of this lecture, but they also put it on statues, tomb walls, anything that they could inscribe. They wrote these types of spells on. So that's what the Book of the Dead is. What's really nice for us today as modern scholars, when we're looking at something as fragmentary as the pieces in the Chapin album, is that we have lots of resources now for dealing with these texts, for studying these texts. Unlike, let's say, 50 years ago or so, now we have lots and lots of tools at our disposal. So for example, there was a project out of Bonn, the Totenbook Project, who went around and cataloged thousands of Book of the Dead manuscripts all over the world in different collections, institutional, private, and otherwise. So we can go immediately right there and start looking for other manuscripts that belong to the same individuals or from the same time period or with the same handwriting, with the same spells, etc. And we have online dictionaries in which Book of the Dead spells have been entered, so we can search the text through tools like the Thesaurus Linguae Egyptii, one of the main dictionary resources we use for studying the ancient Egyptian language. And in addition to that, we can use a lot of the nice, in this case, English. There's lots of German, French, and other translations as well, but I'm just showing you some of the main English translations of the Book of the Dead, where we can go to identify the spells, because in a manuscript like this, you could have up to about 165 spells. And in total, there's roughly 200 individually numbered spells that we associate with the Book of the Dead. And there's a lot of artificial modern cataloging practice involved in that, but that's often how scholars deal with these spells, is by these numbers that have been given to them after 1842. So once we do that with the Chapin album, this is what we can start coming up with. Number one, we can start numbering all the fragments and identifying the bits and pieces that are on them from these Book of the Dead spells. And this isn't for you to memorize or anything. I'm just sort of showing you what some of these are. But the main point to take away from these slides is, as you can see from the identification of the spells, these fragments are not put together in any particular order. It's really a random assortment, and you can sort of imagine, again, a dealer with a box of loose papyrus fragments and deciding, let's just glue these into this album in a way that looks somewhat appealing so that we can sell them. And you can see, even in cases like this, where this top fragment, it really looks like it belongs to this fragment underneath it. But in fact, these are two different spells. You can see fragment 15 with Book of the Dead spell 18 and fragment 14 with Book of the Dead spell 147. So two spells very far apart in an original manuscript from each other. And it's simply been pasted over the top of this manuscript lining up this yellow column. But these two pieces do not have a direct relationship to each other. So large parts of this album are full of those types of fragments. So what it's necessary to do is to look at all of these very closely, identify the spells that you find on them, and then try to start sort of putting them back together, because any of these fragments, even if they look similar to other fragments around them, it's not always guaranteed that they went together. So just to show you on this fragment here, this fragment number 31, doesn't seem to be part of this larger spell sequence on these other fragments, which do seem to go together. This one seems to be pasted in from another section, maybe from the same papyrus, but also from a completely random different papyrus. And so you can see the complexity that you end up with in this sort of fragmentology, trying to deal with these very randomly associated fragments together. So once we go through and identify what's on them, and we have rough sort of indication of, a number, an inventory number to work with. So here, I'm just giving these, numbering them in order. So up to 55 fragments in this album. Then we can start looking at the process of trying to reconstruct the original orientation of these manuscripts. When I say original, I mean how they were intended and produced in ancient Egypt at the time that they were made. And some of this is a bit easier to do for some of these fragments than for others. So this is a nice set. You can see 3 pages here from the album. You can tell right away, even if you don't know anything about Egyptology whatsoever, that it looks like these fragments go together in some way. They have a very similar style. They have very similar paleographic features, and multiple pages have the name of the owner, Nehemeth Ra-Tawi, that I showed you before here, beginning at the bottom of this column, going into this column, and then again in the last column. And this is an important column because it also gives the name of the father and the mother of Nehemeth Ra-Tawi. So we actually have part of the family lineage there, which is really helpful for, again, identifying other fragments. But of course, these pieces are not put together in any kind of order. You can actually see here, if you look at this fragment on the bottom right of the one page, this is actually upside down. So the individual who put this together must have just lined up this double line border that you can see around the hieroglyphic section. And they just thought, let's line these 2 pieces up. It'll sort of look like they go together, but this is actually upside down to the rest of the text. So what we can start doing is repiecing this back together all digitally. Right now, this album, if you took it to conservators, they would probably have a heart attack in terms of trying to, let's say, get the adhesive off these pieces and reorient these pieces physically right now would probably be very, very difficult and likely result just in more damage to the papyrus. So luckily what we can do today is just use digital techniques to reconstruct what these papyri actually look like. So taking these individual pieces that we have, we can reconstruct a number of sections of Nehemeth Ra-Tawi's papyrus. So for example, here, these pieces going back together, you can see where the joins are. It's clear that these pieces go together. Obviously here, the hieroglyphs run right over the break. And in this case, the name of the owner starts at the end of this column and picks up. And once you identify the spells, this is a continuous set, starting with Book of the Dead spell 1 over here, and then moving into Book of the Dead spell 2 in this section, and actually ultimately in Book of the Dead spell number 6 here in the red section that you see in the last column. So this is then from near what would have been the beginning of this papyrus for Nehemeth Ra-Tawi, assuming that it started with Book of the Dead spell 1. And if you guys want to talk about those numbers and how they get their order, we can do that in the Q&A after. It's plenty of times individual manuscripts don't necessarily start with spell 1. They could also have other texts, not just Book of the Dead spells in them. But if we make a few assumptions, probably this is close to the beginning of this papyrus where this first spell started. Now we have other fragments here, and we can arrange those in order as well. So if we arrange those back to their original order here, flipping one right side up and combining it with a number of these other pieces, what we get then is Book of the Dead spell 15. This is a hymn to the sun god Re, and this is section H. And then there's probably missing 10 to 15 columns based on how much text can fit on these columns. And I'll talk more about the size of these columns in a second. So there must be missing somewhere between 10 to 15 columns. And then the end of that part of the spell, this is section I. So these are just, again, modern designations for different parts of the spell. So spell 15, section H would have continued into here. And then somewhere in here, spell 15, section I, going to the end of this section of the papyrus. So you can see how we can sort of start reorienting all these pieces back together and then actually build digitally what the original papyrus sort of looked like. So we had some section at the beginning. There's usually at the beginning of these papyri, there would have been a blank protective sheet. Then the start of the spells. We have an indeterminate loss here after this beginning of spell 6, because we don't know now, did it have spell 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or did it skip spells? Each of these manuscripts were unique, and they had a unique collection of spells, so we don't know for sure what was here. Then that section with spell H, 10 to 15 columns, and then spell 15, section I. So here we can start to reconstruct this original papyrus that belonged to this woman, Nehemes Ra Tawi. And I should just say at this point that this particular manuscript, in terms of folks who study the Book of the Dead, is a particularly interesting one because of its layout and size. Most Book of the Dead papyri that you see, often, not always, but often they have a height in the range of, let's say, 30 centimeters up to about 45 centimeters in height of the sheet of papyrus. This particular manuscript is about a third of a normal height sheet. And you'll see, just to show you in the second bit, you can see how much longer and taller these sheets tend to be. This is a much thinner version. Now, we have some other manuscripts that are like this, but they're not all that common. So this is a particularly interesting layout for a Book of the Dead manuscript, here being in the 10 centimeter high range rather than 30 to 45 of the larger, more common manuscripts. So this is actually really interesting, and there are some other parallels. We even have some parallels in the Oriental Institute, one of which is from the Roman period, probably around 100 AD. This is definitely earlier than that. I think, in fact, this is the manuscript that probably gave whoever wrote the date of 662 BC in that original sort of catalog entry that I showed you at the beginning of this talk. It's probably looking at this papyrus. This is probably somewhere in between, let's say, 700 BC down to maybe 400 or 350 BC. Hard to be exactly certain. We could talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested, but probably somewhere in that that time period. Definitely not earlier. Could be a little bit later based on the person's name. So we can start sort of reconstructing these. And there's some really interesting little fragments that you find throughout this album when you start pulling these apart. I showed you this fragment earlier to show you the name of the individual who owned it, Osiris Ka-Imter. But there's actually two pieces that we can take. There's a large vertical piece here and this piece on the side that also belonged to Ka-Imter. And it's hard to tell when you first look at it, but when you put the pieces back together and join them up, here's his name again. And what's really nice about putting these two pieces together is not only do we get his name, Ka-Imter, but we get part of his title. He's the Sejem Ash Im Set Ma'at, which means the servant in the place of truth. And why that's actually really interesting is this is a title that's really common at the end of the New Kingdom in ancient Egypt. So this is from, let's say, 1550 down to about 1000 BC. And it's very common with members who are working in a village called Deir el-Medina, who are working on the royal tombs. That's what this is referring to, the Valley of the Kings, the place of truth. And so Ka-Imter, I can't be for sure, this is very preliminary, but I find it interesting that we do know of a servant in the place of truth, Ka-Imter, from Theban tomb 220. Here's a picture. Here's his name inside the tomb, Osiris Ka-Imter. Does this papyrus for Ka-Imter, the servant in the place of truth, belong to this same Ka-Imter? Maybe. Don't know for sure, but I think it's an intriguing possibility. The ways that we might go about further substantiating that is if we had other names in the papyrus or any of the other scraps from the album that we could find that names Ka-Imter's wife, his parents, any of his other siblings. We know quite a lot about the Ka-Imter of this tomb. His tomb is part of a series of family tombs around him, his father and his brother. So I haven't found it yet, but if somewhere in some of these scraps is one of these names, or if we can associate this papyrus closer with this same Ka-Imter, it's possible that this was the original provenience of this manuscript in this tomb of Ka-Imter in the Theban necropolis. But that's very speculative at this moment. And we can come back to that and discuss that in the Q&A if you're interested. One of the most, I guess what I would say is exciting finds from the Chapin Library album are these two fragments. I showed you this one earlier when we were talking about the name of Userhat that's found in it. There's a second fragment found on another page. It's actually that piece that I showed you earlier where there's this second fragment glued over the top. This piece underlying actually also comes from a papyrus belonging to a man named Userhat. You can't quite tell, but here's the name of Osiris, and then this is the title scribe, and then the name of Userhat would have followed, and I'll show you in just a moment how we know that for sure. Now, what's really interesting about finding a name Userhat in fragments of papyri that are inscribed with Book of the Dead spells is that we know of a very famous papyrus of Userhat that's currently in the British Museum. And even this scene from that papyrus, this shows actually Book of the Dead spell number 110. It's often described as sort of the Egyptians' conception of heaven. That's a bit of a misnomer, but that's how it's often presented. Here you can see the owner of the spell in the field of reeds, growing grain, reaping grain, etc. And everybody talks about how tall the grain is and how fertile the area is. And that's why it's sort of often considered as this paradise type of place. But this is a very famous papyrus. In fact, this image was used in the Book of the Dead catalog that I edited for the exhibit that we put on at the Oriental Institute in 2017. And so this is a very well-known individual, and you can see his name written here, Userhat the Justified. Now, this one sheet is part of a much larger papyrus. All these pieces are in the British Museum. So you can see they have the inventory number 10,009, sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These were purchased from Henry Salt, a very famous consul for Egypt who had a major collections that went to Europe through Sotheby's in 1835. Now, when you look at these pieces, you can see this is the right side of the papyrus. And as we get to the left side, you can see it gets much more fragmentary and damaged on this side of the papyrus. And none of the pieces from the Chapin album belong to any of this section. However, there is another piece of Userhat's papyrus in the British Museum, this one with the inventory 9962, totally separate provenance, purchased from Robert James Hay in 1868. So we have a completely separate piece, and you'll see there's obviously three pieces mounted in this frame, but it's only the middle piece that belongs to Userhat's papyrus. This belongs to somebody else. This piece belongs to Userhat. You can see the name written throughout the papyrus. And when we go to look at this and compare it to the Chapin album fragments, lo and behold, the fragments actually join directly to this piece in the British Museum. So the Chapin Library album fragment 14 on the one side with a spell for approaching the fifth gate connects directly. You can see these are actually, this is actually written in retrograde hieroglyphs. What that means is notice that the hieroglyphs face to the right. Usually that means you start at the right and read from right to left. But in retrograde hieroglyphs, you actually read them in columns starting at the left, moving right. So what's really nice about this is you can see we have the fifth gate, the sixth gate, and the seventh gate. So there's no doubt that these three papyrus fragments once went together. They match up perfectly. You can see again, here's the Osiris, scribe, Userhat. Everything fits exactly as expected, including down to the number 7 for the seventh gate that Userhat is approaching in this spell. And you can see how these all fit together. So what this tells us is that unlike that 662 date that we find in the accession materials, some of the earliest, these are the earliest fragments that so far I've been able to date from the album, date all the way back to around 1400 BC at the time of Userhat, who was alive during the reign of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II during the 18th dynasty in Egypt. This is actually really, I mean, number one, to find fragments of this very famous papyrus in this Chapin album is sort of stunning. I couldn't believe it, but also really important because this is the early tradition of the Book of the Dead, these 18th dynasty papyri. The sequence of the spells was not set yet, and it's still early in the tradition. So these are parts of very important manuscript that fills in this early development of, again, what we're calling the Book of the Dead. And if there was any further sort of question about, well, do all these pieces belong together? Well, when you look at these fragments joined together with other fragments from that longer set of 7 sheets from the papyrus, you can see there's a number of similarities that they have in the writing of the owner's name. So notice when you have the writing of Userhat, there's often this space after his name. You can see that in a lot of these examples throughout these papyri. And the reason that that happened is that these papyri were probably inscribed and left with a blank section for the owner's name. So they were basically a sort of template papyrus that, you know, somebody might come in and see and then buy, and then the name was filled in secondarily. And since the space that was left was a little bit larger than necessary, you can see you have this little bit of space at the end of the writing of the name very often, because they just wrote the name and then went on to the next section. They didn't necessarily worry about filling all the little space in between. So these paleographic features, in addition to the direct joins, demonstrate for us that these all once belonged together. So this is sort of the process of going through, working with these texts, trying to figure out what other manuscripts they belong to, but then also their provenance history. I mean, ideally, what I'd like to do by the end of this project is hopefully reveal a little bit more of the story between when these papyri were removed from their original tombs and broken up and then end up in these various collections all over the world. Right now we have bits and pieces of that story, but it would be nice to maybe be able to reconstruct that a little more, because as we can see with some of the provenance history, when we look at, for example, the sale from Robert James Hay or the sale from Henry Salt, it gives us some dates that suggest these acquisitions and these fragments must have been floating around before then, right? So it gives us some dates for when the earliest pieces were coming out onto the antiquities market and started spreading around. Now, it's not just that we have to deal with text in all of these cases, as you've seen with Userhat, which is probably the most striking example that I've so far identified in the album collection of fragments, but we also have uninscribed fragments that just have, or not uninscribed, but or only inscribed with images. And some of these we can begin to also reconstruct. It appears that these 4 probably all belong together as part of a scene from a vignette or an illustration that goes with Book of the Dead spell number 125, very famous spell. Probably many of you have heard of it. That contained the negative confession, so the part where the individual owner was supposed to recite things that they haven't done in life, their sort of sins, quote unquote. And this spell included this large illustration of this owner being brought before judgment in the tribunal of Osiris. And so these fragments that you can see from the Chapin album probably go together from one papyrus into such a scene. So you can see here on the right, the feet and the modern, or not the modern, the dress of the owner of the papyrus, just like you see here. This, I should say too, this papyrus I'm showing you, this is another Oriental Institute papyrus that has a similar scene. So you can see the owner here, just the little tip of the right foot and the hand of the goddess Ma'at, who would be standing in front. Then you have the scale with the heart and the feather of Ma'at, with Anubis and Horus weighing the heart against the feather. Here, the foot of Thoth, who would be inscribing the result of the judgment. The little crook with the sort of royal-looking child sitting upon it. You can actually see the little part of the foot that would have been there. Here, the swallower of the deceased. If you don't pass your judgment, they feed your heart to this this hybrid monster called Amit, or the swallower of the dead. And then here you can see the bottom of Osiris's throne and his foot. So all of these pieces probably go together from one papyrus in such a scene. Now, if you go back and look at the pages, you can see there's these two other fragments oriented upside down to the rest of these that also have a similar scene from Book of the Dead spell 125, the illustration. But when you try to put these together, these are not at the right scale. They're actually much smaller scale than this larger section. So there's at least another papyrus represented here, if not two separate ones. And when you only have a fragment like this with just an illustration, it becomes very, very difficult to connect it with others. So one part of my research that I still need to do is sort of look through lots of Book of the Dead manuscripts with spell 125 illustration that might be missing the head of Osiris, and see if we can fit that back in to one of those manuscripts, if it's out there or not. So that's very difficult one. And finally, I just want to mention, sometimes you will have cases like this, where you have two fragments from this Chapin album. They both have Book of the Dead spell 18 inscribed on them, but they're from two different manuscripts. And we know that because of the paleography and also the section of the spell that they come from. So even though you even have this large yellow dividing column, which is helpful for determining manuscripts that belong together, in this case, these happen to be two different manuscripts. They just happen to have fragments of the same spell written on them. And again, with these, much more difficult. You don't have an owner's name. You don't have a larger section, much more difficult to connect these to larger manuscripts, but it's part of the process that I'm working on in trying to, again, locate the other pieces of these. Now, this is the Papyrus album. There's another, let's say, 30 small fragments like these in that album that are basically unidentified. They don't have a clear owner's name in them, and it's uncertain where they're from. That's going to take a lot of research, just looking into to see if we can identify the other manuscripts. Even if we can't, the nice thing about publishing a catalog of these manuscripts is that some of my colleagues will then see them, and hopefully my colleagues, they may recognize some of them as belonging to manuscripts that they worked on. So getting them into the scholarly literature will be important for piecing those stories back together. And then, of course, once we can connect them to other manuscripts, we can connect them to a provenance history as well. But in addition to that album, the Chapin Library Special Collections also has a collection of Book of the Dead spells on linen from a totally separate provenance. And just to show you these very quickly, you have one set of these 4 fragments mounted together, and then a number of single fragments, all inscribed, again, unmounted. This is actually a good thing, because now these you can properly conserve. They're not necessarily tacked down with an adhesive to some kind of backing. So it's actually nice that these are not mounted, and you could put these through modern conservation techniques to preserve them. And these are also, again, all inscribed with hieratic Book of the Dead spells. What's really interesting is that the Chapin Library collection of these, this archival collection in the library, actually came in to the institution with other fragments that are now in the Williams College Museum of Art. So these 4 linen fragments also inscribed with Book of the Dead spells, these in hieratic, and this with just an illustration. You can see If you remember that Userhot papyrus we were looking at, this is also the vignette from Book of the Dead spell 110, where the deceased is shown growing this grain and plowing the fields. These all came in together through a gift of Horace Mayer in 1961, going back to a collection by Vasily Bey before that. And we don't have a lot of time in this lecture to look at it, but just to give you one sort of exciting and intriguing example from all of these, you can take 2 of these fragments from the Williams College Museum of Art, put them together with 4 other fragments from the Chapin Library collection that belong all to the same original individual. So all of these pieces, so the Williams College Museum of Art, Chapin Library Fragment 8, etc. And you can see the Book of the Dead spell numbers here, 43 through 47, 74 through 75, and etc. These all belonged to a single set of bandages that were used to wrap the body of a man named Hep-Minech, probably in the Ptolemaic period. So let's say between 300 and 50 BC. And what's really interesting then about these bandages from Hep-Minech, not only can you put the collection together between Chapin Library and the Williams College Museum of Art, but there are other bandages from this same set that also belong to Hep-Minech, now in collections all around the world. The beginning of the set is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This just shows you a small fragment of it. Their acquisition records just state unknown in the collection before modern cataloging, and then 1906 is the date given. This has the first spells 1 through 15. A section in Boston has the next section, spell 17. Notice where it comes from. The Horace Mayer collection, 1934. So the same collection through which Chapin Library and the Williams College Museum of Art got its fragments of these linen bandages. There's another section in Heidelberg and another section in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. And the sections in Williams College Museum of Art and Chapin Library would have come very soon after these here. So these would have been long bandage strips. They're often numbered, so you might have up to 20 bandages that were used on an individual wrapping them. And to sort of illustrate why we might find them in this sort of context now, or in this state, and this is where I want to show you a brief image of human remains, although it's completely covered. This is what these bandages would have been used originally. This is a mummified body of Hep-Minech, that's the man's name. This is currently in this St. Louis Art Museum on loan from Washington University. And you can see when you look closely, here are the inscribed linen bandages still wrapped around, and then with the sort of funerary liquids that had been poured over it. That's why you see these black stains on Hep-Minech's bandages. That's from the funerary preparations. And you can see that at some point, probably in the 19th century, these bandages were torn off. This was very sort of common at that period. Many collectors were unbandaging mummies, or even having mummy unwrapping parties where these mummies would be unwrapped. And so these bandages were sort of ripped off of these original context, and then you get them in these mini fragments that then are sold to collectors all over. And, these 50 years ago, and even still today, but 50 years ago, between 1850 and 1950, owning something like this was very, very common. In the library at the Royal Institute, I routinely get inquiries about, my grandfather owned this linen bandage fragment. They bought it from so-and-so, or collectors sometimes will contact us. And these pieces are spread all throughout the world now. But what we can do with some of this material from Williams College is then start to put it back together so we can understand both the material, but again, with this particular collection, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the story will be piecing together the provenance history from all these pieces that have now made it into Williams College. So what we have total is 55 total papyrus fragments. They range in date from 1400 BC to about 50 BC, and 14 total linen fragments ranging in date from roughly 400 BC to 50 BC. And my main work right now is going through and putting them into a catalog, something like this, so that all of this information can then be published and made known to other scholars and academics working on this similar material. So I'm happy to take questions, and I want to say thank you once again to Anne for inviting me to give this talk, for alerting me to this material, and for my colleague Brian Muse for including me on this discussion. And thank you very much.
Foy, thank you so much. That was an incredibly detailed but also super accessible presentation. And I really appreciate that as somebody who's emphatically not an Egyptologist and never will be, but will definitely be teaching regularly with this material for quite some time to come. So I'm really excited to know more about both the content of the fragments and the history of collecting this kind of material. And thanks again. So with that, we'll go straight on. We have some questions that are coming in through the chat, and we would encourage anybody with questions, please use that Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen to type out your questions. That just allows us to get them organized and give Foy a chance to sort of think through all of this process. The first question that we received was actually totally procedural. And that asked, will we be making the recording available to our attendees? And the answer is yes, you will receive a link to the recording in your email if you registered for the webinar, and we'll make that available for at least a couple of weeks. Next question, how did you get started working with fragmentology?
Wow, yeah. If you work in any ancient material, it's basically of necessity. All of this kind of material is sort of fragmentary now, just by nature. So any kind of, if you work on pretty much any ancient text, or, as medievalists who might be attending know, most of this material has gone through a lot of hands and a lot of processes, and very, very little of it has ended up sort of complete nowadays. That's in fact one of the Orient Institute papyri that I showed you during the talk. One of the reasons why this one here, it was so exciting to our founder James Henry Breasted when he saw it at a dealer in Cairo, was it's basically complete from beginning to end. So it's a very rare case where you have something like that. Most of this stuff is fragmentary by nature. So I think if you're going to do something like Egyptology, which is maybe a different story, how I got involved in that. But if you're interested in that, material culture from the past, by nature, it's fragmentary and incomplete. And so looking at this type of manuscript material, what you find is that we're all sort of trying to get at some of the same goals. So, colleagues who are working in medieval manuscripts, although it's often in sort of different materially, that is, we rarely find, let's say, a papyrus fragment that's been outside of modern context, in an ancient context, sort of rebound together in a book with other things, or totally unbound, and now they're two separate pieces. It's a little bit different like that, but we're ultimately have sort of some of the same goals in trying to establish the provenance history and reconstructing the original use and forms of this material. So I think it just comes with any examination of pre-modern material.
Great. Going back to something that you mentioned during the talk, could you say a little bit more about how you come up with date estimates for the manuscripts?
Sure. It's a tough one, and it just depends on a number of features. So number one, there are certain formats of the papyri and the layout of the text that are more common in certain times than in others. But also the most important is, again, identifying the individuals involved. So when you can identify something like Userhat, we know who Userhat is, we know his titles, we know when he lived. That makes it a lot easier than when you just have fragments. When you just have fragments, and this is also, I saw this papyrus questioned in the chat, something like this, where you don't have it connected to a known individual and you just have a name. Sometimes all you have is a range. And one thing that you can use in this particular manuscript, for example, is this writing of the name of Osiris with this little flag at the end. This is the Netcher sign is what we call it. It's the sign for God. And this is just a determinative, so a little sign that comes at the end of the name of Osiris. So this particular orthography, this spelling of the name of Osiris, is really only common after and during Dynasty 25. So you see it crop up at the in Dynasty 25. So again, let's say 800, 750 BC or so, and then it's used really commonly after that, but it's not so common before that. It is used before that, but very sparingly. And people have studied this and looked at this. So things like the orthography that they're using here, we can use that to help date identifying the individuals. When you look at things like the Userhot papyrus that we saw, as I mentioned, these columns are written in retrograde. That's also not something that's very common in other periods. So much more common in the New Kingdom. And again, this is Dynasty 18 papyrus. So this retrograde writing where you read it from left to right, even though it looks like you should read it from right to left. That's also more common in certain periods. Apart from that, if you just have, so for example, something like this, this can be extremely hard to come up with a date for some of these. Now, with these borders, we can actually probably make some judgments from art historical analysis, looking at other papyri with these similar borders. But just cursive hieroglyphs like this, they're using these over a range of, roughly 1700 years. And a very early text and a very late text can sometimes look incredibly similar. So if you only have paleography, so the style of the signs, and you're only dealing with cursive hieroglyphs like this, then it can be very difficult and dangerous to assign a date. You're likely to be wrong. That's a little bit different when it comes to the hieratic text. So if you're looking at, some of the linen fragments that we saw, the hieratic is a little bit easier to date. It's still by far not perfect, but the style of the paleography, the handwriting, is a little bit more distinct through the periods rather than the cursive hieroglyphs. These have an incredible consistency over time and space. So if you only have a little fragment like this, sometimes it can be really difficult to know, does this date to 1500 BC or 300 BC? Could be sort of anywhere in that. Now, this particular main piece, I should say, with these borders, it's probably on the earlier end of that, but you have to be careful with how you apply those principles because it's not 100% standard across time.
Thanks so much. As somebody who's used to working mostly in the 19th century, that's a fairly horrifying date range, but
Yeah.
uh, really helpful to understand. Another thing that you kind of just touched on in your previous answer that we'd love if you could expand on a little bit. How distinct were names in ancient Egypt? So did many people have the same name, or were they unique? And how do we sort of attest that through the fragments that we have?
Good question. Often, I mean, the short answer is, very rarely do you come across a name that's unique. Lots of people had the same names. So just to give you an example, let me go back and look at one of the earlier examples we looked at. Okay, somebody like this, Padihor, incredibly common name in the late periods of Egyptian history. So let's say anywhere again from 600 down to the Roman period, they're using this name Padihor. It's very, very common. So just the name alone wouldn't tell you much. So in a case like this, you would want to combine the name with the title that he has, with the type of manuscript, with the paleography. So you look at all of those features to come up with a date. But the names themselves are generally not unique. So, for example, when I was talking about this papyrus of Ka-Imter, and I'm really, I'd really like to connect it with this Ka-Imter that we know from this tomb, who had this same title, Servant in the Place of Truth. This is why I said this is very speculative, because I don't know for sure. And in fact, what I sort of didn't bring up in this talk, but we even have a tomb for a man named Userhot, who was a scribe who lived during the reign of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, TT 56, Theban tomb number 56. Is that the tomb of the man who owned this papyrus? Hard to be 100% certain without, let's say some of the fragments of the papyrus were found in the tomb. Or what's more important with this identifying individuals is, as I mentioned earlier, I think if we go back to the Nehemes Ra Tawi manuscript, One of the most important things that we can have are two things. One, if they have any titles. So like we saw with Usar he's called scribe, Ha'imter, servant in the place of truth, Padihor was called the one who loves God. The titles can help, so that limits it down. So if you have somebody with completely different titles or they're in a much lower part of the bureaucracy, it's probably not the same person. But more importantly, when you get the parents' names. So in this papyrus of Nehemes Ratawi, we have here the name of the father and here the name of the mother. Now, this Nehemes Ratawi, I have not yet been able to connect it to any particular individual. There are other Book of the Dead manuscripts for people with the name Nehemes Ratawi, but they are not this manuscript. They are all written, they might be written in hieratic, or they're the larger size, 30 plus centimeter manuscripts. They're all from the Ptolemaic period. So, and I should say all the owners of those have different names for their parents. So this Nehemes Ratawi does not seem to be the same as Nehemes Ratawi from the other manuscripts that we know belong to somebody with that name. So yeah, lots of people had the same name, and the real way to go about trying to distinguish are parentage and titles when you have them. That's the best that we can go on. And sometimes you still don't know. Actually, Brian and I, we have a book that's in press where we're confronting this problem. We have a collection of texts that names somebody, and that same name is known from other texts, and we want to connect them together. We think they're the same person, but it's hard to be 100% certain.
Fantastic. Sticking with Nehemes Ratawi, what Chana Algarvio asks, what would be your explanation for the unusually small size of that particular papyrus? Monetary factors, owner's personal preference? Is there any sense?
Well, with this particular one, I don't know. There's a lot of discussion, and it's very speculative about, let's say, a smaller papyrus would be cheaper, and so it would be more affordable. So maybe somebody didn't have the money, or let's say they just didn't want to spend a lot of money on such a papyrus, they could buy it. Unfortunately, we don't really know enough about that part of the process. This ancient buying of the papyrus, we know roughly, we have some numbers from ancient Egypt about how much these papyri cost, and they could be very expensive. So a few months to even like a year's wage or something like that for, let's say, a middle level functionary in the bureaucracy of the government. So, what I often compare it to is it's sort of like somebody buying a very nice sports car today, right? Like they're making this very big investment. And some of them could have even saved longer, right? It could have been a bigger investment. You can imagine somebody buying a very expensive car that they really shouldn't be able to afford, but they're spending their money on it. So with something like this, it's really hard to say with this individual manuscript, why is it smaller? It could be a lot of reasons. What I'm trying to determine, I haven't done this yet. This is sort of part of the research that I need to do, but I want to go through basically all the manuscripts that we have that we know and put together a group that are in this format, because I don't think there's anybody who's really looked closely at this smaller format in particular. And so I want to put all of those together and see what we find. It's possible that this was just fashionable at certain periods. As I said, we have a late Ptolemaic, early Roman, and a very long papyrus. This is the other thing. Even though it's thin, we don't know how long this papyrus was. It could have been very long. It sort of looks on the screen here. You can see it looks like it sort of comes to an end here, but we don't know for sure if there was something after this. And the one that we have in the OI that is this same height, or roughly the same height, the sort of half of a typical papyrus sheet height, it's very long. It's like 40 individual sheets. So it's possible that it was just a fashion. It could have been person's preference. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is I'm not sure. There's a lot of speculation, but it's hard to be certain. I will say one thing that could be intriguing. I sort of doubt it with the preservation of these fragments, but occasionally papyri are actually pasted down to the mummy itself. And so we have a number of examples. I mean, when I say a number, like a handful, less than 5, where the papyrus was actually sort of plastered over the mummy itself. And it seems that they even planned for certain spells to be over certain body parts. Now, I doubt it with something like this, but that's always another possibility, is they could have made it a size to fit something in particular. But I think the more likelihood is this was just, let's say, the style of the scribal workshop in the area where this person was commissioning the papyrus. That's would be my best guess, but it's really a guess.
Great. The next two questions are kind of related, so I thought I might ask them at once. One patron asks, how consistent is the language from one version of the Book of the Dead manuscript to another? Is there a lot of variation? Is there anything specific you would say, speaking to the Chapin manuscripts about that? And then Bob Kosofsky asks relatedly, it's my understanding that the text of the Book of the Dead was not fixed, and then one can derive some dating based on the idiosyncrasies of a particular manuscript. So could you speak to those questions of textual variation and then dating based on textual variation?
Yeah, sure. So part one is, yeah, there are lots of variants. I mean, it's really interesting with something like these texts. On the one hand, they are remarkably consistent. Again, the earliest, what we call, again, and I'm trying to be careful here, what we call Book of the Dead, we see in the second intermediate period. So you're talking, let's say, around 1700 BC is when it's like first attested, and that's attested all the way down to the early Roman period, so about 50 AD. And sometimes those texts are extremely similar from even the wide ends of that date range. So you could look at a spell from a manuscript in 1700 BC and the same spell in a manuscript from 50 BC, and they can be very, very close in wording. Other times there can be huge differences. And in fact, the papyrus that you're looking at on the screen, this one that I mentioned before that the founder of the OI breasted was impressed with, is why he bought it. When you look at it, it looks really, really nice, right? It has very nice proportions. It's done really, really well. But when you read the text is a garbled mess. And there are parts where clearly the person writing it down didn't have a clear understanding of what they were writing. And it's actually nothing that I've worked on officially yet, but my working hypothesis is that the reason that this particular manuscript looks so nice, but the texts are so garbled, is one hypothesis I have is that it was written by an illustrator. So it's actually not a scribe who's really familiar with the text who's writing it, but you have an illustrator who's just trying to copy out the text, but doesn't really quite understand the grammar, because the papyrus that you see on the screen, this dates to about 200 BC, but the language date all the way back to 1700 BC, right? So by 200 BC, this was a very archaic version of the language. So to answer the question, there's lots and lots of variants, and every manuscript has individual variants. And yes, there are interesting variants in and bits and pieces in the Chapin material. In particular, that Nehemes Rautawi manuscript has a couple of interesting variants. And yes, it's true, you can, when you have the right variants, use that for some dating principles. So it really depends on how you can track the variants. So sometimes you'll get a variant in a text that's unattested. You don't have it anywhere else. There's nothing you can really do with that in terms of dating. But if you have a variant that only started to appear in a manuscript after a certain date, then that can help you to limit the range of the date for a particular manuscript if you can connect it to those various traditions. So one person who's done a lot of work on this is a scholar named Malcolm Mosher Jr. He's actually in the process of publishing something like a 10 to 15 volume set of books. I think he's put maybe 10 of them out already, that are all studying Book of the Dead spells and their variants in the later periods of Egyptian history. So let's say 800 down to 50 BC. And what he's doing is putting them into groups based on these variants to show which manuscripts were probably made in the same workshops. So yes, you can use the variants sometimes for that kind of dating, but just as often the variants could be unique. There was another papyrus that I'm working on from the Getty that I was reading maybe a month or two ago. And it has this really interesting section at the end of a spell that's not attested in any other manuscripts. And there's some really interesting stuff in there, but it's completely unique to that manuscript. I don't know of any other examples.
Thanks. Cindy asks, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that the name of one of the owners is erased. I wonder if there's a particular reason for this.
I wonder too. I mean, in this case, I don't know. So you see this is the fragment that we were talking about before, and the name was erased. And I'll just say, just for the record, when I first looked at this, I actually thought what was written in here was sometimes in these templates manuscripts. Remember when we were talking about Userhot, we were saying that the text would be written and then a space would be left where the owner's name would be put. And then when the person bought the papyrus, a scribe would go back and add the owner's name. So when I first looked at this, sometimes instead of just leaving a blank space in Egyptian, they'll write min. And this is just a word that means so-and-so. And they'll say min, son of so-and-so. So so-and-so, son of so-and-so, which is like just a filler. It's just a filler for this spot. And I thought that's what this said when I first looked at it. But the more I looked at it, I'm pretty sure it actually has the name Amenemhat that's been erased. Now, why is it erased on this little piece of this small fragment here? I really have no idea. There are lots of options. You know, it could have been a manuscript that somebody was thinking about reusing. It could have been a mistake that the scribe wanted to erase and put in the correct spelling or a different name. It could have even been, I think this is very unlikely, but you know, just to mention it, it could have been part of damnatio memoriae, so sort of erasing someone's memory by erasing their name, the memory of that person. I don't think that's the case with a manuscript like this, but we never know. Could be lots of things, but just having this little bit, not having connected this to anything else yet, at least, I'm really not sure. It could be any of those possibilities. If it's possible to maybe find another manuscript, perhaps for Amenemhat, that seems to be the same Amenemhat. Now, if we can do that, maybe we can look through that manuscript and maybe it'll tell us something a little bit more. So for example, maybe nowhere else in that manuscript the name was erased. So maybe this was just some kind of mistake, or maybe everywhere it's erased and it looks like somebody very intentionally didn't like Amenemhat. These are all possibilities, but I think prior to really knowing for sure which is which, it'll require a bit more research on connecting that fragment to a larger manuscript tradition.
Great. As you mentioned, there are a couple of medievalists here with us today on the talk, and we have two related questions. Kristen Herdman asks, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Is there a particular program or piece of tech that you find particularly helpful for working with fragments? And then Beth Fisher asks, you mentioned medieval manuscript research. Are any of the tools used for medieval manuscript fragment analysis like Viscol or machine learning for iconographic matching being used on Egyptian fragments?
Right. I guess the short answer is that I've wanted to employ more, like, you know, there's a lot of these different viewers now that they're using with, you know, IIIF technology, Mirador, and these other things that people are using. And I've really wanted to set up such a project, but to be honest, I haven't yet. And I'm actually kind of curious to see how, for example, some of these viewers can be used with scrolls rather with codices, because it's one thing to use them. They actually seem to work really well in many cases for recombining the fragments of a codex, but it's much more difficult, it seems, to work on them with a very long scroll. They do work, obviously. There's a number of places doing it. You can see it in several collection websites, collection searches. But personally, I haven't used a lot of them yet. I mean, most of the stuff I'm still doing sort of, you don't want to call it old fashioned, right? But I'm doing it with sort of digital images, but outside of a viewer technology. There is a little bit that has been done. I know that I have some colleagues who are working on a large edition of a text that's called the Myth of the Sun's Eye. And they're working in a sort of digital platform that allows them to rearrange the manuscripts, annotate and comment on the manuscripts to each other. And I think that's really useful. As far as machine learning, there has been some recent developments on this, although not as much. It's still sort of in its early stages, I think, of trying to use machine learning to, you know, learn hieroglyphs and then identify either broken passages or reconnect manuscripts together based on broken passages. But from what I've seen, it's still really in its infancy in terms of how much it can do. So I'm sort of excited. I'd really like to see some more technology employing things like neural networking to basically see if a computer can learn Egyptian without us teaching it the rules. Because there's a huge debate in Egyptology about how the language works, especially like the language of these types of texts, this Middle Egyptian that they're using. And it would be great to see if such neural networking technology could sort of reveal something that we haven't seen with our human minds that might help solve some of the debates that we have. So I would say that it's all still very early. I don't think there is it's beginning, but there hasn't been yet the widespread adoption of some of these viewer and annotation technologies that medievalists are using, which I'm jealous of and I need to learn more about.
Thanks. Another question from Chana Algarvio. What do you think the papyri has the spells written in cursive hieroglyphics? Oh, pardon me. Why do you think the papyri has the spells written in cursive hieroglyphics, whereas the linen fragments have spells written in hieratic? Is there a significant difference to the scripts being used?
There is, and particularly over time. So at the beginning of this tradition, it's actually complicated and interesting, but I'll sort of simplify it. When you're looking at, let's say, 18th and 19th dynasty manuscripts, the vast majority of them are going to be in cursive hieroglyphs. And the main reason is because hieratic at that time was the sort of everyday script. So it's the script they're using for their tax receipts and their letters and their business. And so it didn't have the sort of sacrality that hieroglyphs had. So they're using hieroglyphs because they sort of had a very formal association, right? You use them for very formal high register text. So, the king who's going to inscribe the temple, he's going to inscribe it in hieroglyphs. He's not going to inscribe it in the everyday language of hieratic. And likewise, if you're going to make a very formal document, like a Book of the Dead for your tomb, you're going to use the most formal script. Now, over time, that changes. So the reason that you see in this case, as the question asked, when you look at these linen fragments and they're written in hieratic, by this time, so we're talking probably the Ptolemaic period for this, by this time, the everyday script is demotic. So they're using demotic for their administrative language or script, for their tax receipts, for their letters. And now by this time, hieratic has that sacrality. That's actually why it's called hieratic, right? From the Greek designation for sacred, because it was that application was given to that script in this period, after which it could have that sacred nature. So yeah, there is a pattern to that over time, where hieratic joins the upper level sort of sacred scripts. And then, of course, over time, demotic happens as well. So at the beginning of this, so let's say in roughly 400 BC, they're not writing any of the funerary material like Book of the Dead type material in demotic. You don't get that till the end of the Ptolemaic period. So right around, let's say 55 BC, then they start using demotic for this type of material, because of course by then most of the population is speaking Greek and they're using Greek as their administrative language, etc. And so there's this sort of development in how these scripts are used and for what.
That's fascinating. I've known the word hieratic for years, but I had never made that connection to the Greek etymology. So thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Bob Kozowski asks, were Book of the Dead manuscripts always buried with the owners, or is there any evidence of them being passed down through families?
It's actually a really good question. And as far as I know, I should go back and review a little bit on this, but as far as I know, I don't know of one where it's being passed down through the family, because they're made for an individual. So I don't know of one that, let's say, a father commissioned and then passed it on to their son, or a mother commissioned, passed it on to the daughter, who passed it on to their daughter. It seems to be a very individualized piece. I mean, even unlike tombs, a tomb can be used for a family burial, and it might be used for, a father, a son, brothers, sister, something like that, depending on the period and the place. But these manuscripts are usually quite specific. There are some exceptions. I mean, I'm thinking of, we have a papyrus for Nojmet, who was a queen, and she mentions very prominently her husband, the sort of pseudo king Herihor. But in general, these are sort of really individualized, and probably 99.9% of what we know suggests that they were used in that individual's burial.
Okay, and last anonymous question about individuality. Someone says, I'm very interested in the way that the manuscript may have been pre-crafted and the name simply added after the fact. How often are these manuscripts actually crafted for a specific individual, I guess kind of from the get-go, the patron is asking, and then compared to the ones that are manufactured before and then named later?
Right. So I guess the short answer is very commonly the manuscripts are written for a specific individual, and it depends on a lot of different factors. So, for example, looking at this papyrus from the Oriental Institute that I put up here, this is written in hieratic, and very commonly texts that are laid out in these lines. So, right, a line right to left, and then these lines are organized into columns. Quite often, these hieratic texts include the name of the owner with the writing of the text rather than trying to leave a space for it. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen in hieratic text, it does, but this is sort of very common for these. So very commonly it's written like this, where the name is included from the get-go with the material. And so as far as I'm very hesitant to sort of give you any numbers, but it's also common to have these template text where you write out the text, leave a space for the name, and then fill in the name later. And even in some cases like this, forget to add it or something like that. And so I don't know, is that 50-50? Is it 75-25? I don't know the exact sort of percentages, but I would say it's very common both ways. We have lots and lots and lots of manuscripts that are made for specific individuals and their name is included with the flow of the text. And we have lots and lots of manuscripts that were made with a space left for the individual that was added later. And again, that's one of the parts that we know so very little about how this worked. We don't know whether this person would have walked into sort of a shop and said, oh, I like that one. Give me something like that. Or make sure you have this kind of spell or that kind of spell. There are certain cases where these manuscripts were like Userhat, where they were made for or by scribes or for or by priests, where it seems very, very likely that those people had input in what the manuscript looked like and what it contained. But just as often, it seems like that people could have just sort of buy a stock piece where like, you're the priest, you're the scribe, you figure it out, and I pay you for the result. But that's a part of the process that we know almost nothing about.
Thank you so much. That's the end of the questions from the chat, and we are coming to the end of our time. I just have one last question. As somebody working in an institutional collection, we have quite a few guests here who are from beyond Williams, and I suspect that there might be quite a few other American institutions and institutions around the world that have these small groups of understudied papyrus or linen fragments. So if that's the case, and if there are folks here who fit that definition, what do they do? Like, what's the best way for them to get in contact with scholars who might be interested in working with their collections or helping them understand what it is they have and where their small pieces fit into this larger global study?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess part of the answer would depend on what type of material they have. So if you just don't know, right? Like if you just say, I think this is Egyptian, let's say, exactly what you did, Anne, is a great thing to do. Contact one of the main institutions that deal with this type of material, ask some questions, start a dialogue, and see, if they know people, the experts in this type of material that might want to work on it. So, if you had come to me with something completely outside of my specialization, or come to Brian, we probably would have directed you to somebody else. So it depends how much you can identify the material to begin with, right? If you know that it's Egyptian, at least you can start contacting major institutions. Oriental Institute's a great one. There are lots of other institutions that deal with Egyptian material and Egyptology. But like you had, Anne, if you had something where you knew, oh, these are like Book of the Dead spells on papyri, there are some of these projects, as I mentioned in the talk, that have people specializing in this. So I'll just again plug the Totenbuch project. Obviously, if somebody didn't know that from the beginning, it might be hard for them to sort of stumble upon that. But again, if you contact an institution dealing with this material, they can point you in this direction. As we were talking about, Anne, I think at the beginning of this, you were sort of saying, I was thinking about putting these up on Papyri Info and Trismegistos and some of these projects. And for Book of the Dead material in particular, this is the project for it. So we really want to get all the material we can into this larger data set because they've already done a huge amount of the work. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of manuscripts cataloged in here. So this type of material, this is really the project for it, this project out of Bonn. Obviously, if you just have something that looks Egyptian and you don't know, well, then you might need a little consultation before going the next step.
Okay, well, thank you again so much for sharing your research with us, for a terrific talk. And we're really looking forward to seeing how this project progresses over the next months and years. So I think we'll close here, but thank you everyone for attending, and you're welcome to be in touch with Williams if you have any further questions. We will be sending out a link after the presentation. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.